Imagine you have survived the worst decade in living memory. You survived the mud and the gas and the gunfire of the Great War. You survived the flu that swept the world in 1918, a plague that killed more people in months than the war had in years. 50 million dead. Maybe more. Bodies stacked in church halls. Cities silent with grief. And then, something shifted. The lights came back on. The music started playing. And an entire generation decided, all at once, that they were done suffering. That it was time to live. What happened next would redefine what it meant to be modern. It would reshape how people dressed, how they danced, how they thought about money, freedom, race, and power. It would produce some of the greatest art and music the world had ever heard. It would mint millionaires overnight, and make criminals into kings. And it would end in catastrophe. This is the story of the Roaring Twenties. And it begins, in the wreckage of a world that had nearly destroyed itself. November 11th, 1918. The guns fell silent across Europe. After 4 years of industrialized slaughter, trench warfare, poison gas, artillery barrages that could be heard from miles away, the Great War was finally over. The numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. 17 million dead. 21 million wounded. Entire villages in France, Belgium, and Britain that had sent their men to war and never saw most of them return. Empires collapsed, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian Tsardom. The map of the world was being redrawn almost overnight. And then, as if history hadn't dealt humanity enough suffering, the influenza pandemic of 1918 arrived. Moving with terrifying speed, it killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people worldwide, more than the war itself. Cities instituted mask mandates. Schools closed. People were afraid to leave their homes. Sound familiar? By 1920, the world was exhausted, traumatized, hollowed out by grief. But it was also free. The old world, the rigid Victorian order of kings and class hierarchies, of corsets and calling cards, had been swept away by the war. And into that vacuum rushed something entirely new. Especially in the United States. America had entered the war late, in 1917, and paid a far lower price than the European powers. Its cities were intact. Its factories were running. And its economy, supercharged by wartime production, was beginning to boom. Unlike Europe, which would spend years rebuilding, the United States was primed to explode. The 1920 census revealed that, for the first time in American history, more people lived in cities than on farms. It was a tipping point. America was urbanizing at dizzying speed. And the cities that were swelling with new arrivals, from the rural South, from Eastern Europe, from Appalachian farms, were becoming crucibles of something new. Something modern. Something loud. Wages were rising. Products were getting cheaper. And in boardrooms and factory floors across America, a handful of visionaries were about to change the very nature of work and consumption forever. There is one man whose name, more than almost any other, defines the economic transformation of the 1920s. And that name is Henry Ford. Ford hadn't invented the automobile. But what he had done, what he had perfected, was something arguably more important. He had found a way to make them affordable. The key was the assembly line. In Ford's Highland Park plant in Michigan, production had been revolutionized. Instead of skilled craftsmen building one car from start to finish, Ford broke the process into hundreds of small, repetitive tasks. Each worker did one thing. The car moved along a conveyor belt. And the result was staggering. In 1908, a Ford Model T cost $825, equivalent to roughly $26,000 today. Already cheaper than its competitors, but still out of reach for most working families. By 1925, that same car cost just $260. Ford had driven the price down by nearly 70%. And he'd done it by building more cars, faster, than anyone had thought possible. By the mid-1920s, 1 out of every 2 cars in the entire world was a Ford Model T. Think about what that meant for ordinary life. For the first time in human history, the average working family could own a personal vehicle. They could drive to a town they'd never visited. They could commute to a job farther from home. They could take a Sunday trip to the countryside, or visit relatives in the next county. The automobile didn't just change transportation. It changed the geography of daily life. Cities began to sprawl outward as suburbs emerged. Gas stations and motor courts appeared along newly paved roads. Traffic jams, something almost no one had experienced before 1910, became a regular nuisance. Even the concept of a drive-through restaurant was, eventually, born from this new culture on wheels. But Ford's influence went beyond automobiles. His production philosophy, mass manufacturing, standardized parts, efficient assembly, spread through virtually every industry. From radios to refrigerators, from vacuum cleaners to processed foods, factories across America adopted the assembly line model. Goods that had once been luxuries became affordable. And consumers, with more money in their pockets than previous generations had ever known, were ready to buy. This was the birth of the modern consumer economy. And it was driven by something else Ford understood intuitively. If you paid your workers enough, they could afford to buy what they were making. In 1914, controversially, Ford had announced a $5 workday for his factory workers. More than double the industry average. Critics called him crazy. But Ford understood the logic. Well-paid workers were consumers. And consumers were the engine of growth. By the 1920s, that logic had become a mainstream economic gospel. And the result was a consumption boom unlike anything the world had ever seen. Advertising, which had existed for decades as a relatively straightforward announcement of products, was transformed in the 1920s into something far more sophisticated. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, pioneered the use of psychological techniques in marketing. He didn't sell products. He sold identities, desires, a sense of self. Buy this car, and you are a man of progress. Wear this perfume, and you are a woman of sophistication. Smoke this cigarette, and you are free. Modern. Liberated. The 1920s didn't just create mass production. They created mass desire. And that was perhaps the more powerful invention. It wasn't just the automobile that was reshaping daily life in the 1920s. It was technology, moving faster than society had any precedent for. Consider the radio. On November 2, 1920, a Pittsburgh station called KDKA broadcast the results of the presidential election, the first licensed commercial radio broadcast in American history. It was heard on homemade receivers in a few thousand living rooms. Within a decade, there would be over 12 million radio sets in American homes. Think about what that meant. For the first time, a family in rural Arkansas and a family in Manhattan could hear the same music at the same moment. A president's speech could reach the entire country simultaneously. A boxing match, a baseball game, a jazz performance from a nightclub hundreds of miles away, all of it flowing, invisibly, through the air, into your living room. Radio didn't just entertain. It knitted the country together. It created, for the first time, a genuinely national popular culture. Before radio, a hit song might take months to travel from New York to Kansas City. After radio, it happened overnight. And then there was cinema. Silent film had existed since the 1890s. But in the 1920s, it became the dominant entertainment form of the Western world. Hollywood, a neighborhood in Los Angeles that had been farmland just a decade before, transformed into the capital of global pop culture. By 1928, roughly 100 million Americans attended the cinema every single week. In a country of about 120 million people. The stars of the silent screen weren't just famous. They were mythological. Charlie Chaplin, the Little Tramp, was arguably the most recognizable face on the planet. His films blended physical comedy with genuine social pathos. He made audiences laugh at poverty, at authoritarianism, at the dehumanizing machinery of industrial capitalism. He was a global icon before global icon was even a concept. Then there was Rudolph Valentino, the dark-eyed Italian-American actor who became cinema's first great sex symbol. His death in 1926, at just 31, triggered genuine mass hysteria. Women fainted at his funeral. The New York Daily News reported over 100,000 mourners lining the streets. Gloria Swanson, Lillian Gish, Douglas Fairbanks. These weren't just movie stars. They were the new gods of a secular culture, their faces 20 feet tall on silver screens across the world. And in 1927, everything changed again. The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, became the first feature film with synchronized dialogue. Sound had come to cinema. Within 2 years, silent film was essentially dead. The transition happened so fast that many silent film stars, whose expressive faces had made them famous, found their voices simply didn't fit the new medium. Careers evaporated overnight. Whole studios had to be rebuilt from scratch. While cinema was transforming entertainment, another revolution was happening in the sky. On May 20, 1927, a 25-year-old airmail pilot climbed into a small single-engine plane at Roosevelt Field on Long Island. He had a bag of sandwiches, a compass, and, intentionally, no parachute. He wanted to save the weight. 33 hours and 30 minutes later, Charles Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget Airport in Paris. He had flown the Atlantic. Alone. Non-stop. The reaction was unlike anything the modern world had experienced. 100,000 people flooded the Paris airfield to greet him. Back in New York, 4 million people lined the streets for his ticker tape parade. President Coolidge sent a warship to bring him home. Overnight, Lindbergh became perhaps the most famous human being alive. His flight didn't just inspire. It ignited the imagination. If one young man, alone, in a small propeller plane, could cross the Atlantic, what else was possible? Within years, commercial aviation companies began service. The age of the airplane had truly begun. Back on the ground, electricity was transforming domestic life in ways that are difficult to overstate. In 1900, only 8% of American homes had electric power. By 1929, that figure had climbed to nearly 70% in urban areas. And with electricity came a cascade of devices that permanently altered the rhythm of daily life. Electric washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, electric irons, toasters. These weren't merely conveniences, they were liberation. For women especially, who had spent countless hours each week on domestic labor, these machines returned time. Time that could be used for work, for leisure, for education, for culture. The 1920s were, in the most literal sense, the decade when the modern home was invented. If the automobile was the economic symbol of the decade, jazz was its soul. Jazz had its roots in the African-American communities of New Orleans, in the blues, in gospel, in the complex syncopated rhythms that black musicians had been developing for decades. It was music born from the particular genius and particular suffering of the African-American experience. And in the 1920s, it exploded into the mainstream with a force nobody had anticipated. Louis Armstrong, the son of a New Orleans laundry worker. A kid who had been sent to reform school at 12 and taught himself cornet by ear. By the mid-1920s, he was the most innovative musician in America. His improvised solos, technically brilliant, emotionally shattering, transformed jazz from a collective folk form into something closer to high art. When Armstrong played, something happened to a room. The rhythm changed. People's bodies moved involuntarily. The music seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique, from something in the chest, the gut, the ancestral memory. Then there was Duke Ellington, the composer and bandleader who brought jazz to Carnegie Hall and made it undeniable as a serious artistic form. Jelly Roll Morton. Bessie Smith, whose voice could crack a heart open at 50 paces. Fats Waller. Art Tatum. The roster of genius was astonishing. Jazz traveled north with the Great Migration. As hundreds of thousands of African Americans fled the racial violence and poverty of the Jim Crow South for the industrial cities of the North, they brought their music with them. Chicago, New York, Kansas City, Detroit. The music took root everywhere. And white Americans, and Europeans, fell in love with it. Record labels rushed to record it. Radio stations broadcast it. Nightclubs on both sides of the Atlantic paid handsomely for jazz bands. This cultural transfer was complicated and contradictory. Black musicians and composers often received far less credit, and far less money, than the white performers who recorded their songs and played to white audiences. Jazz was embraced, but the people who created it were still denied basic civil rights, still subjected to violence, still barred from many of the venues where their music played. The Jazz Age celebrated black creativity while simultaneously exploiting black creators. That tension ran beneath the surface of the entire decade. But in the clubs, in the backrooms and basement speakeasies and packed dance halls, music was also a form of resistance. Of joy. Of insisting on humanity in a world that was often willing to deny it. And nowhere did that collision of art, race, freedom, and joy play out more dramatically than in Harlem. The neighborhood that sits at the northern end of Manhattan had been predominantly white and upper middle class until the early 1900s. As black families arrived from the South and from the Caribbean, they transformed it into the cultural capital of Black America. By the 1920s, Harlem was something extraordinary. The Harlem Renaissance was not a movement in the formal sense. There was no manifesto, no founding meeting. It was more like a flowering. A sudden, extraordinary concentration of black artistic talent in a single place and moment in time. Langston Hughes was 20 years old when he began publishing the poems that would make him famous. His verses were written in the rhythms of jazz and the blues, vernacular, immediate, deeply felt. He wrote about what it meant to be black in America. About longing, and rage, and beauty, and absurdity. About being told again and again that you were less, and refusing to believe it. Zora Neale Hurston, novelist, folklorist, anthropologist, was documenting the richness of Southern black culture at a time when most of academia ignored it entirely. Her novel Their Eyes Were Watching God would eventually be recognized as one of the great American novels of the 20th century. Claude McKay, Count T. Cullen, Jean Toomer, Nella Larson, Aaron Douglas, whose bold, geometric visual art drawn from African forms would influence graphic design for generations. Jacob Lawrence, a constellation of brilliance. They were creating a new literature. A new visual culture. A new sense of what Black American identity could mean, not defined by white supremacy's diminishments, but by the full complexity of their own humanity. Their work rippled outward. White American readers discovered it. European intellectuals wrote about it. The Harlem Renaissance announced to the world that African American culture was not a footnote to American civilization, it was its heartbeat. And at the center of all this, in the clubs, in the dance halls, in the art studios and speakeasies, was a new kind of woman. She cut her hair, shortened her skirt. She smoked in public. She drank. She danced in ways that made her grandmother reach for her smelling salts. She drove a car. She held a job. She voted. She was the flapper. And she was the most visible symbol of everything the 1920s stood for. And everything the old world feared. To understand how radical the flapper was, you need to understand what came before. A respectable woman of 1910 wore her hair long and piled high on her head. Her dress covered her ankles. She did not appear in public without a chaperone. She did not speak freely to strange men. Her identity was primarily defined by her relationship to the men in her life. Father, husband, son. By 1920, American women had won the right to vote. That single, hard-won achievement was both a product of and a catalyst for a much deeper shift in how young women understood themselves and their place in the world. The flapper was a rejection of all of it. The hair went first. The bob, short, sleek, equal parts practical and defiant, became the defining female haircut of the decade. Barbers who had never cut a woman's hair suddenly found their shops full of young women. Demand for hairpins and elaborate styling products collapsed overnight. When a woman bobbed her hair in 1921, she was making a statement that everyone around her understood perfectly. Then the dresses. Victorian women's clothing had been designed, in part, to constrain. Corsets, heavy fabrics, high necklines, long skirts. The 1920s silhouette discarded almost all of it. Waistlines dropped. Hemlines rose. By 1925, skirts were hitting at the knee, shocking the country. Fabrics became lighter. Movement became freer. The body beneath the clothes was, for the first time in centuries, allowed to exist. The flapper danced. The Charleston. The black bottom. The foxtrot. In dance halls and jazz clubs and private parties, young bodies moved in ways that had never been considered respectable. Couples danced close. The music was fast and the night was long. She smoked. Cigarette companies, not slow to catch a trend, began marketing directly to women for the first time. The cigarette became a symbol of independence, of equality. Edward Bernays, our friend from the marketing world, staged a famous publicity stunt in which he arranged for debutantes to march in New York's Easter Parade while smoking, calling cigarettes torches of freedom. She worked. The 1920s saw a significant expansion of women in the professional workforce, as secretaries, telephone operators, department store clerks, nurses, teachers. These weren't the liberated careers of later feminism. Many were low-paying, and few reached management. But the presence of millions of young, single, wage-earning women in the cities was itself transformative. They had their own money. They made their own choices. Not everyone was thrilled. Newspapers ran op-eds lamenting the collapse of femininity. Churches denounced jazz dancing as moral depravity. Parents despaired over their daughters. Critics argued that the flapper was a symptom of a civilization in decay, that the recklessness and hedonism of the decade were evidence of moral rot. The flappers, by and large, ignored them. They were having too good a time. But it's important to note, the flapper was primarily a white, middle-class phenomenon. Black women, immigrant women, poor women, most were not living the carefree life of a nightclub dancer. They were working double shifts. They were raising children in cramped tenements. They were navigating a world that was far harsher and less forgiving than the one the magazine images suggested. The Roaring Twenties roared more loudly for some than for others. That contradiction was woven into the decade's fabric from the very beginning. While the nation was dancing and building and buying, the United States government was doing something no one had ever successfully attempted in a modern democracy. It was trying to make the country sober. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution took effect. Prohibition. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages was now illegal in the United States of America. The most ambitious social engineering experiment in the nation's history had begun. The people behind Prohibition were, by and large, sincere. The temperance movement had been building for decades. Alcohol consumption was genuinely destructive in many communities, tied to domestic violence, poverty, and public disorder. Reformers believed that eliminating alcohol would improve family life, raise productivity, and purify the national character. What they hadn't fully considered was human nature and economics. Within weeks of Prohibition taking effect, the illegal liquor trade was booming. Brewers, distillers, and saloon owners who had lost their legitimate businesses simply moved underground. Speakeasies, illegal drinking establishments, proliferated at staggering speed. At its peak, New York City alone had an estimated 32,000 speakeasies, twice the number of legal bars that had existed before Prohibition. The demand for illegal alcohol created an extraordinary economic opportunity, and criminal networks moved to fill it. In Chicago, one man filled it better than anyone. Al Capone was born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrant parents. He was brutal, intelligent, charming, and completely ruthless. By his mid-20s, he had relocated to Chicago and worked his way to the top of a criminal empire that controlled the city's bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution operations. At the height of his power, Capone's operation was generating an estimated $100 million a year. In 1920s money, he employed hundreds of men. He bribed politicians, police officers, and judges. He owned clubs, restaurants, and breweries operating openly under the noses of law enforcement, because law enforcement was, frequently, on his payroll. Capone wasn't an aberration. He was the system working exactly as Prohibition had accidentally designed it. When you ban something people desperately want, you don't eliminate the demand. You transfer the profits from legitimate businesses to criminal organizations. It's one of the most thoroughly documented lessons in economic and social history. And it was written in the blood and corruption of the 1920s. The violence was real and spectacular. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, in which 7 members of a rival gang were lined against a garage wall and shot to death by men dressed as police officers, shocked even a public that had grown somewhat accustomed to gangland killings. It was a new kind of crime, organized, corporate, and utterly indifferent to public safety. But there was a darker irony beneath the violence. The speakeasy, the place where people went to illegally drink, became something else. Something more interesting. Because when a place has to operate outside the law, it can't enforce the social laws either. Speakeasies were some of the most racially integrated spaces in 1920s America. Black jazz musicians played for mixed-race audiences. White socialites sat at bars beside black entertainers. Women drank alongside men without chaperones. The normal social hierarchies were suspended, at least for the duration of the night, at least between those 4 walls. Prohibition did not stop Americans from drinking. It taught them to drink in secret. It enriched criminals. It corrupted public institutions. And it created a generation that had a deeply ambivalent relationship with the law. A generation that had learned, viscerally, that some rules were simply made to be broken. Prohibition would remain in effect until 1933. By then, its failure was so obvious, so total, that it had become a cautionary tale. One that, history suggests, has not always been remembered well. By the mid-1920s, the American economy was producing wealth at a rate the world had never seen. GDP was growing. Unemployment was low. The stock market was climbing. And ordinary Americans, for the first time in history, in significant numbers, were investing in it. Before the 1920s, the stock market was largely the domain of the wealthy and the professional investor. But the prosperity of the decade, combined with rising wages and accessible financial brokers, had democratized investing. Shopkeepers and secretaries, factory workers and school teachers, millions of ordinary Americans were buying stocks. And the stocks kept going up. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had stood at around 108 in August 1921. By September 1929, it had reached 381. A gain of over 250% in 8 years. Anyone who had invested in the market had watched their wealth multiply. Stories of ordinary people becoming overnight millionaires circulated freely. Financial columns in newspapers promised readers that the party would never end. But beneath the dazzling surface of prosperity, cracks were forming. The most dangerous practice was buying stocks on margin. In the late 1920s, you could purchase $100 worth of stock by putting down just $10. You borrowed the other $90 from your broker. This was fine as long as prices kept rising. You'd collect the gains and pay back the loan. But if prices fell, even slightly, you could lose everything. And the broker could demand immediate repayment. Millions of Americans were playing this game. They didn't fully understand the risk. They had been told, repeatedly, that the market only moved one way. There were other warning signs that careful observers were noticing, but that the general public largely ignored. Agricultural prices had actually been declining throughout the decade. The farmers who had expanded production during the war, buying equipment on credit, plowing up new land, were now struggling under the weight of surplus and debt. Rural America was not sharing in the prosperity. And it would be hit hardest when the collapse came. The real estate market, which had been experiencing its own speculative frenzy, particularly in Florida, had already collapsed by 1926. Parcels of swampland had been selling for thousands of dollars to buyers who had never seen them, on the assumption that prices would continue to rise forever. When the bubble burst in Florida, it was a preview. No one was watching. Manufacturing output, the real engine of prosperity, was beginning to slow by 1928. Consumers had bought cars. They had bought refrigerators and radios. And eventually, demand slows. Inventories began to pile up. Companies began to struggle. Profits began to disappoint. But the stock market, detached from economic reality by the intoxicating momentum of speculation, kept climbing. The Federal Reserve was worried. Interest rates were raised to try to cool the speculation. Some voices in finance, a minority largely ignored, warned that the market was dangerously overvalued. That the gains were paper profits built on borrowed money, not real underlying value. They were right. And they were ignored. Because the party was still going. The music was still playing. The glasses were still full. And why would anyone leave a party like this? October 1929. The signs had been accumulating for weeks. Prices had been volatile through September. Certain sectors, steel, construction, auto, had been weakening. Investors who had been using borrowed money to buy stocks found that their loans were being called in. To pay the loans, they had to sell stocks. Selling drove prices down. Lower prices triggered more margin calls. More selling. It was a spiral. On October 24, 1929, a day that would become known as Black Thursday, the market opened and immediately began to fall. Panic spread across the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. 12.9 million shares were traded in a single day, a record that reflected not enthusiasm, but terror. A group of major bankers intervened. They pooled resources and bought stocks at above market prices, trying to restore confidence. It worked, briefly. Prices stabilized through the end of the week. Many observers believed the worst was over. They were catastrophically wrong. On Monday, October 28, the market fell again, sharply. And on Tuesday, October 29, Black Tuesday, it collapsed. 16 million shares traded hands. Prices fell across the board. Millions of investors who had borrowed to buy stocks were wiped out entirely. The paper gains of the entire decade evaporated in hours. Companies that had been worth hundreds of millions of dollars were suddenly worth almost nothing. Some of the most dramatic stories were of personal devastation. Men who had been millionaires on paper went to bed unable to pay their rent. Life savings, deposited in banks that had speculated wildly with their customers' money, were simply gone. Not lost, not diminished, gone. Vaporized. The crash itself was a single traumatic event. The Great Depression that followed was a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded over years. Banks failed, thousands of them, taking their depositors' savings with them. Businesses closed. Unemployment, which had been under 4% at the height of the boom, climbed toward 25% by 1933. 1 in 4 American workers had no job. Families lost their homes. Children went hungry. The breadlines and Hoovervilles that became the visual vocabulary of the Depression were a direct consequence of the speculative excess of the decade before. The Great Depression spread beyond America. European banks, which had made loans to Germany under the post-war Dawes Plan, found those loans suddenly in jeopardy. Germany, already struggling with the punishing terms of the Versailles Treaty, plunged into economic crisis. Unemployment soared. Political extremism grew. The democratic institutions that had been built after the war began to buckle. We know what happens next. But that story belongs to the 1930s. What do we make of the Roaring Twenties, nearly a century after they ended? They were real. The joy was real. The creativity was real. The progress was real. The 1920s gave us mass production and the modern consumer economy. They gave us Hollywood and the radio and the electrical home. They gave us jazz, arguably the greatest musical form the 20th century produced. They gave us the Harlem Renaissance, a body of literature and art that enriched American culture immeasurably. They gave us the first serious challenge to traditional gender roles. They showed us what modernity could look like. They also gave us a warning we keep forgetting. The prosperity of the 1920s was real, but it was unevenly distributed. It rested on borrowed money and speculative faith in markets that could not sustain what was being asked of them. The warning signs were visible, for those who wished to see them. They were largely ignored, because the party was too good, and the music was too loud. Every generation that follows seems to rediscover this lesson in its own way. The belief that a rising market means permanent prosperity. That new technology makes old economic rules obsolete. That this time is different. It never is. The men and women who danced in those jazz clubs, who drove their Model Ts down freshly paved highways, who watched Charlie Chaplin on silver screens and listened to Louis Armstrong on crackling radio sets, they weren't fools. They were people experiencing something genuinely extraordinary. They had survived the worst the world could throw at them, war, plague, grief, and they had come out the other side wanting to live. Wanting to feel. Wanting to be modern. We shouldn't be too hard on them for missing what was coming. But we should remember it. Because every era has its version of the Roaring Twenties. Every era has its booms and its breathless certainty that the good times will last forever. Every era has its music playing so loudly that you can't quite hear the warning. The question is always the same: will we dance until the music stops? Or will we listen?